Welcome to the Pulsus Research Seminar for this week. As you know, this is a forum in which we bring together cutting-edge research and fine researchers, either from outside of UQ or sometimes we get the opportunity to showcase work of our own colleagues, as we did with Nikki just last week. So it's a great opportunity today to have, actually I think it was the week before. So it's a great opportunity here to have Professor Ian Clark, who is a senior member of the faculty, to talk to us today on questions of war and legitimacy, and I've forgotten the exact title. I don't have it in front of me.
Okay, I will come back to the title so you don't need to.
Okay, all right. So I'll hand it over to Ian.
Okay, thanks Chris, and thanks to all of you for coming along. Thanks especially to Eloise for her email and for raising your expectations. For me, that raises the bar that I fear I would need to be a Russian athlete if I were to aspire to get over it. So I last had the great pleasure of addressing this seminar 2 years ago, when I was just completing the rewrite of my book on waging war, and I spoke about that then. This is the kind of sequel, the update, where I've got to in the interim. Basically, to set the context, I've been doing a couple of things, and this talk and the paper related to it come out of these two things. The first thing, with Chris and Emily and Seb, we've been doing some stuff on the state of the law of war, what condition it's in and how we know. And so I think it's fair to say, by way of context, that issues of the law of war are slightly more to the front of my mind than they might otherwise have been. Secondly, I've been continuing to follow the literature on the ethics of war and some of the central debates and exchanges within it, with a growing sense of both bemusement and irritation. And I think there are some core debates in the literature that have now reached what I would see as a total dead end. And part of what I want to do is to try and explain why it seems to me they've now hit the buffers in particularly unfortunate ways. So that's kind of where this comes from. The title, by my standards, this is quite mischievous, and there's a couple of times in the presentation that I will try and explain the mischief that lies behind the title. But let me clarify. The title is Recapturing Just War from the Ethicists. Okay? So, a couple of clarifications at the very beginning. I've got nothing against ethicists. Some of my best friends are ethicists. However, there are some things that the ethicists have been doing in relation to just war that I am beginning to get both bemused and irritated by, and hence the provocation in that particular title. Again, to restate my credentials, that I have no in principle objection to the ethics of war. I've been teaching the subject off and on for 35 years, so I think I can reasonably claim that I don't come at this with any prima facie disdain for this particular subject. Nonetheless, I do have some reasons for concern. And the reasons are essentially twofold, and let me set out the two lines of argument that I seek to present in the talk this afternoon. The first is about the relationship between ethics and law, and the original version of my title was a kind of banal descriptive thing like that, which would have attracted an audience of two, I suspect. What I'm going to talk about is a revisionist school within the ethics of war that I want to characterise as being largely unmindful of, unheedful of the consequences for the law of war of the ethical positions that they espouse. And so I want to set out an argument expressing my own irritation at the disjunction between ethics and law that some of this writing is, I fear, encouraging. Then I want to have a second bite at the cherry by kind of standing back from this, and rather than just express my own irritation, although you'll see through this, I'm really just expressing my own irritation 2 times over. But it's another way of expressing it. I think there is now a dialogue of the deaf going on out there, and people are talking past each other. And I want to diagnose why that should be so, why they cannot understand the point of the other side in this particular debate. And this is why I think these exchanges have now reached some kind of dead end. So I want to go through these arguments in these two phases. Another quick explanation about the title. I sent the paper on which this is based off to Ethics and International Affairs a couple of months ago, and it's under review there. So this is not a strategy I would recommend for my junior colleagues in the school, but I thought, what's the most gratuitously offensive title that I can send to Ethics and International Affairs? And that's the best that I could come up with. We will see if I get my due dessert when they send it back with
David
thanks, but no
David
thanks.
Rosen's reading it.
Anyway, so now to get into the first argument, ethics and law and how they relate to each other, and this is a hugely complex issue, and people have written entire books about the general relationship, let alone specifically in the context of war, which generates some distinctive problems. I need to say a little bit about the literature for those of you who are not familiar with it. Otherwise, everything I say will make no sense at all. Even if I give you the context, it may still not make a great deal of sense, but that's then my fault. So the kind of main protagonist that I'm responding to here is Jeff McMahan, a name that will be familiar to many, a moral philosopher, taught a long while in the United States and has recently gone back to the White Professorship of Moral Philosophy at Oxford University. To make clear, there is nothing ad hominem in my relationship with Jeff McMahon. Back in my Cambridge days, I knew Jeff when he was a young JRF. We shared similar interests in the ethics of nuclear weapons. You know, I haven't seen him for a long while, but you know, it's not as if there's anything personal in our relationship that would explain. And McMahon is only, you know, the leading protagonist, but my objection is to a whole host of other writers who say not dissimilar things on the essential subject of the relationship between ethics and law. McMahon is identified, for those unfamiliar, to put this in the briefest context I can, he's understood to be challenging what was the orthodox position expressed in Michael Walzer's book, Just and Unjust Wars. Orthodox, particularly with respect to a central argument of that book, which was that just war theory has two central debates: the ad bellum, which is a debate about the just causes for going to war in the first place, and the in bello, which is the debate about the principles governing the just conduct of war once you're already in that condition. And Walzer's orthodox position, which is essentially also the position that you find underwriting international humanitarian law, is that we don't really carry over the findings from the first, the ad bellum, into the second. So we make judgments about who's just and unjust in terms of causation, but we don't let that then govern the principles that apply in terms of the conduct, in terms of the principles that apply in conduct. They apply equally, whether you're just or unjust. That's the orthodox position. And McMahon has challenged that really quite fundamentally, and, he's developed a very high profile, deservedly, for doing that. I mean, the big presumptions do have to be challenged, and I totally credit him with doing that. But the way specifically he has managed to do that is by more specifically questioning the whole notion of the moral equality of soldiers, which is Walzer's brief summation of what I've already said. And his argument is there is no moral equality among soldiers. What we need to do exactly is to carry across what we find from the ad bellum into our discussion of the in bello, and therefore he argues we need to separate out just soldiers who have no moral liability to be attacked at all from the unjust soldiers who do. So whereas in Walzer's scheme you essentially find all soldiers are in it together, they share an equal liability to be justly attacked, that's what they are, and that's the price that comes with the uniform. On the other side, there are the non-combatants, and we can group all of them together, and the big moral distinction is between the combatants and the non-combatants. Jeff McMahan just draws lines across that whole scheme and says the combatant-non-combatant distinction is essentially ethically not very interesting. And the really interesting ethical issues are to do with how we divvy up the combatants, those that justly deserve to be harmed and those that do not. So that's basically what McMahon's about. If anyone wants to pursue that, I'll happily do that in the questions. We could have a discussion about these debates, but that's not really what I'm here to talk about. What I'm here to talk about is a profound implication of everything that McMahon does. And it's not that he is unaware of what he's doing. What he does is to create a radical separation between ethics and law. And he's quite open, explicit about this. Let me quote a couple of key sentences. The law of war, he says, must be substantially divergent from the morality of war. And he goes on to justify that by saying that if we look at the principles that underwrite the law of war today, the corresponding ethical principles are manifestly false. And therefore there is something deeply wrong about this, and what's wrong is the law. Ethics is right, ethics speak and we should pay due heed. The law is getting it wrong, and we can kind of push law aside. So it's that radical separation, the implications for law, that I find profoundly disturbing, and I want to push back against. I'm not alone in doing this. In a much straightforwardly practical way. People immersed in the history and practice of the laws of war, people like Adam Roberts, Jeff's old chum at Oxford, have been pushing back against this for a long time. So there's nothing particularly new in me doing that. But I want to set out a particular set of reasons why I think McMahon's project is deeply unfortunate in the division that it creates. And underwriting it, I think, is the general feeling I have that it creates, whether intentionally or not, a disdain for the role of international law in the regulation of warfare because of its preoccupation with ethical issues. And let me have 3 goes at trying to justify why I think this disdain is misplaced. Famous international historian who got into writing about humanity in warfare and the laws of war, Geoffrey Best, who I got to know 20 years ago, absolutely incredible academic, who reinvented himself from a historian of 18th century England into the central figure in these debates. And Geoffrey Best, in his text on the laws of war, says something very interesting. I quote, "The law of war began in ethics, and it has kept one foot in ethics ever since." And it seems to me that's not a bad kind of principle to hang on to. That we separate these two things at our peril, both for law and for ethics. The destructive impact on law, and I would say an encouragement of the irrelevance of ethics in this particular field. And so I don't think we can allow that kind of separation. Now, this gets into really complex issues. Ethics and law, it seems to me, certainly in this field, they can never be identical. What ethics demand and what the law requires are at best always going to be a rough approximation of each other, and there are good practical reasons for that. Moral philosophers can make fine distinctions that are simply untranslatable into the field of battle. They're just not practical in that sense, and so they're never going to be exactly the same, and I'm not here to suggest that they should be. But it's one thing to make that acknowledgement. It seems to me quite another thing to say, well, let's just separate them entirely and discuss the ethics and regard the law as a wholly secondary enterprise that we may or may not eventually get round to considering the consequences for. So that's my first objection. The second is, and I think I've been saying this for quite a long time, there is, it seems to me, an inherent reductionism in McMahon's project. He is interested in talking about the ethics of war. And in order to get at the best ethics, we simply set aside the whole issue of the law of war. Why is that reductionist? It's reductionist in this sense that McMahon seems to assume that there is this thing objectively existing out there that we call war, and we can then move immediately to have an ethical conversation about it, leaving aside all the legal implications that might then have. And that seems to me, at a basic conceptual level, to be quite misleading. Why? Misleading because if you read a lot of the literature, certainly written by the international lawyers, and you might well say, well, they would say that, but you find absolutely entrenched in that literature what seems to me really something that we do need to take seriously and pay due attention to, the idea that war is already a legal concept. And so it's part and parcel of the literature, and a lot of political science literature acknowledges all this, the idea that war is a legal institution. War is a legal construct. So war isn't part of the natural world existing out there. We've already constructed it in a particular way, and fundamental to that construction, the process of international law. So to say that we can have an ethical conversation about war, leaving aside law, is simply profoundly misleading. You can't, because law is already embedded in that concept, and so you mislead if you try and do that. The third, and this comes back to the project I'm doing with other people in the room, the state of the law of war today, and I think it's fair to say it's in a reasonably troubled condition. No one would say all is perfect in terms of international humanitarian law. Now, let me be ever so careful in what I say here. Do not misunderstand my argument. I'm not here to argue that Jeff McMahan is responsible for all the ills of international humanitarian law, and when Islamic State decide to shoot prisoners or to behead various people, they're doing this as a sign of their disapproval of Jeff McMahon's moral philosophy. Clearly that's not the point. And yet, and this is a harder argument to make, it does seem to me that in a context when the law of war is already in deep trouble for various reasons, and you can have an argument about what these reasons are, to profoundly unsettle the only ethics we have that is readily translatable to the battlefield is, at the very least, inopportune, I would submit. And so, not helpful if your concern is what is actually happening in the world out there, rather than just having a moral philosophy discussion in the seminar room. So that's me venting my spleen on the first issue, the ethics law. Let me now move quickly on to the second, sit back from this. What's actually going on here? And you look at some of the exchanges, and I'll say a little bit about some of these, and it just increasingly comes across to me as the dialogue of the deaf. That one side, the Orthodox, are restating their central propositions, and Jeff McMahon and the revisionists are countering with all the kinds of arguments that they have already laid down, and there's just no meeting place. Why should that be? What is really going on? So I've been giving some thought to that and come up with my own explanation that allows me to kind of restate some of my own positions by the back door, as it were. I think the starting point to make clear, Jeff McMahon is a moral philosopher. The title of his chair at Oxford says that very clearly. That's what's in the tin. Michael Walzer, political theorist. I think most people would say I'm a student of international relations. I think where you come from in terms of what you think just war is, I think is heavily dependent on the disciplinary perspective that you bring to bear, and that's what I want to try and develop. And my argument in the second stage is essentially this, that what seems to me to be going on at the moment is not just a set of ethical disagreements between the revisionists in the Orthodox school. Not, we all understand the problem the same way. You have your position, I respect it. I have my position, I hope you respect mine. The civilised academic dialogue. It's not really like that at all, because I think there is now clearly emerging a degree of mutual incomprehension and exasperation that neither side really understands what the other is getting at, and that can't possibly be very productive. So let me illustrate very, very briefly what I'm getting at. And I reference here some exchanges that took place in the pages of Ethics and International Affairs over the past year. And it was a set of exchanges about drone warfare. That's a specific, and I'm not getting into this, the concept of a jus ad vim that one of the proponents had been advocating, and that's kind of by the by. The two protagonists in the exchanges were Helen Frau, who's written a textbook on the ethics of war, very much from a moral philosopher's perspective. And it's kind of interesting, but for me, a slightly frustrating read for all sorts of reasons. And she wrote to Ethics and International Affairs complaining about one of the articles that Daniel Brunstetter had written on this theme of a jus ad vim. The jus ad vim is about the use of force short of war. Okay, and drone warfare is particularly implicated in that kind of concept. And so Frau wrote this letter to Ethics and International Affairs that objects to the whole notion for various reasons. But I think at the heart of her disagreement with Brunstetter is expressed in the key sentence that she writes, that this whole approach, the jus ad vim, I quote, places unwarranted weight on whether something counts as war or not. And she doesn't like that, and neither does Jeff McMahan like that. They think moral philosophers have got no business getting dragged into political categorizations about various types of violence. Political scientists can get up to that if they want. That's not the moral philosopher's business. They deal with ethics, and we don't need to be sidetracked by issues about whether something is war or not. Well, if you kind of throw your mind back to what I said about war as a legal institution or a legal construct, not sure you can really wriggle out quite as easily as she says. But then Daniel Brunstetter, who's one of the editors of the Journal of Military Ethics, wrote his response to Helen Frau. And there's a key sentence, and to me it captures the mutual incomprehension here. The key sentence is, my own view is grounded in an empirical observation about how violence is adjudicated in international society. No prizes for guessing which side I'm going to end up coming down on here. So, a purist ethical perspective, we don't need to get dragged into categorizations of various forms of violence, whether it's war or not. It's not our business. Let's start, Brunstetter says, with the empirical observation of how violence is actually adjudicated in international society. And I think these two talk past each other. Why? Well, here I make appeal to an old favourite, and I want to try and explain the failure of this particular dialogue by appeal to the standard way of subdividing the approaches to the whole idea of political legitimacy. And the idea of political legitimacy is conventionally divided into two broad ways of approaching it, thinking about it. One is the normative. We set up our own ethical principles in which we make a determination about whether or not something is legitimate. Or alternatively, what is variously called the empirical. You can see the Brunstetter quote speaks to this, the empirical, the sociological, the Weberian, in the Max sense, rather than the Max. That kind of approach. So the first discusses legitimacy in terms of, if you like, its own exogenous normative principles and standards. You know, we make a judgment about whether Donald Trump is an acceptable candidate for the US presidency. The second is the insider account, not the outsider account. It refers to how legitimacy is understood within the relevant social constituency. And what I would then like to suggest is that what is happening now, and the reason for the failure of these various arguments to meet in the middle, is that Jeff McMahan, Helen Frau, and various other ethicists are expounding an essentially normative account of just war. And others, Michael Walzer, Henry Shue, and various others, are responding with an essentially empirical or sociological account. This is how just war is understood in terms of the practices of international society. Let me come back to the title once again, just to end up with one final set of remarks. The title again, I'm not just making mischief in the title and seeking to offend the ethicists. If I do, so be it. But there you go. But of course, what I'm playing on is exactly the famous preface in the original edition of Walzer's Just and Unjust Wars, where he sets out as the object of his enterprise recapturing the just war for political and moral theory, he said. So that phraseology is already deeply embedded in this literature. And 3 years later, of course, Hedley Bull, when he reviewed Walzer's book in World Politics in 1980, I think it was, used the title Recapturing Just War for Political Theory as the title of his rather sniffy review of Walzer's book. In what sense was Walzer recapturing just war for political theory? Well, you can make that argument at a variety of levels. He's very candid. It's a political book in the sense that it came out of the anti-Vietnam movement, and he's very clear about that. He became interested in these general questions because he thought there was something fundamentally wrong with American resort to force in Vietnam. But at a much deeper and more interesting level, it's a work of political theory in the two senses that the whole argument works if it works at all, and of course many people dispute that it does work, because it's suffused with a pre-existing concept of the political community, and that's what underwrites a lot of his specific arguments. And if you don't buy into that, and of course many cosmopolitan ethicists don't buy into that, and so they're never really likely to meet anywhere in the middle. But it's also, I think, a work of political theory in the sense that these political communities are themselves grounded in some kind of wider framework, an imperfect international society, if you like. Walzer describes his own book as a book of practical morality. That's the phrase that is used. And I think what is meant by that is the idea that the morality he is interested in is, not sitting in a room in Corpus Christi College in Oxford and imagining the best ethics that might be applied to the conditions of war, but a morality that is already rooted in an existing social practice. And that social practice is the practice of international society. The state that justly uses force not only defends and protects its own interests, does something more than that. It defends and protects the rules of international society. And ultimately, that's why some uses of force have to be accepted, because, those that break the rules have to be taught a lesson for doing so. So it's embedded in a wider set of assumptions. In that sense, I come back to where I set out from. We can't simply set law aside with the suggestion that if time allows, we'll come back and revisit the law later. Because law is fundamental to that existing practice. And the tradition of just war is not then simply a tradition about the ethics of war. It's a tradition about the entirety of that social practice, and that includes the preeminent place that law must play in it. And it accepts some of the fundamental political assumptions that are themselves embedded in the concept of war, that make war such a powerful conceptual configurer of what we think are acceptable and unacceptable forms of violence. So my argument then finally is that McMahon is not simply setting out a theory about the ethics of war. What he's doing is setting out an ethics of war that quite clearly rejects the wider assumptions of that social practice, and therefore is a normative theory that stands quite clearly in contrast to the empirical sociological understanding that people like Michael Walzer, Henry Shue, I won't put myself in that august company, that myself would regard as fundamental to the understanding of how just war has actually been practiced. And for that reason, I think at this particular juncture, we need to wrest just war back out of the hands of the ethicists. Thank you.